My friends, it is an absolute honor for us to be here with you this evening. It's an honor for Tikvah, and it's certainly an honor for me. One need only look around the room. It's very humbling, this evening's gathering. We have so many members of so many different communities from South Florida represented here this evening, including the lay and professional leaders from across the spectrum of Jewish organizations and schools. And at the outset, I really would like to recognize specifically the members of the Tikvah Society and the leadership of the Tikvah Society who continue to make so much of what Tikvah does here in New York, in Jerusalem, B'kol Makom Shehu, so very possible. And as anyone who has ever planned an event, large or small, knows, when things look like they're going swimmingly, and gosh, that was easy to do, it's because there was an army of people who made sure that everything was attended to with such polish and panache. And I do want to just recognize the Herculean contribution of so many members of our team at Tikvah who worked tirelessly to bring this evening together. And that, of course, is Caroline and Alex and Lenita and Lauren and Aviva and more. And I certainly hope I'm not leaving anyone out who's here on the ground from Tikvah. But my friends, we really owe them a real big yasher kayak. So thank you so much. And I find myself this evening especially gratified to be hosting this event in partnership with two beautiful Kehilos HaKodesh, the Boca Jewish Center, and of course our host this evening, the Boca Raton Synagogue, Rabbi Goldberg and Rabbi Gibber. If you're here, I haven't seen you yet, but if you're here, I say shalom. We are very grateful and appreciative of your partnership and welcome, and you really do honor us. Thank you with your presence here this evening. So to set this stage for tonight's talk, I would like to tell you a little bit about who we are and what animates Tikvah's work. So first, who are we? Who's Tikvah? First and foremost, Tikvah is an ideas institution. We incubate and produce some of the most important scholarship in the Jewish world today through Mosaic Magazine, through our weekly Tikvah podcast, through the hundreds upon hundreds of hours of video courses that we release each year, through teacher colloquia. Tikvah delves into those very issues of great societal complexity and urgency, from what should an educated Jew know, which is our featured essay in Mosaic this month, to exploring the very character and essence of Jewish memory, from discussing Israel-China bilateral relations to contemplating the ascendancy of the neo-pagan rituals in the post-religious West. Tikvah is committed to cultivating a community of intellectual rigor and nuance. And, as I suspect many of you may know, we're honored to partner with seminal scholars, including, of course, our very dear Rabbi Salavechik, to help amplify their voice and bring their scholarship to broader community, Jewish and otherwise. And in fact, to further this aim, Tikvah launched MayorSalavechik.com just this past year, and there goes the sign. You know, adhesion and humidity, I'm not so sure that's a winning combination. We're going to try this one more time. Here we go. My friends, we need different tape next year. And so we launched MayorSalavechik.com last year to serve this very function, to bring disparate streams of educational content and modalities into one online home to connect the rabbi and his scholarship with audiences the world over. But Tikvah is so much more than that. Tikvah is a community of dedicated people from all walks of life who share several common core beliefs. The belief that ideas matter. The belief that the Jewish people has powerfully and positively affected the West and should continue to do so. There goes the sign again. I'm going to leave it down. Yeah. Impact on the West and should continue to do so through the prism of Jewish values and scholarship. And the belief that excellence in Jewish education, it can never begin too early and it certainly never gets old. And Tikvah is animated by the vision of Jewish excellence, and we try in our work to cultivate Jewish leaders, if you will, the Mayor Salavechik of tomorrow. And our thousands of students every year in middle and high school, in gap year programs in Israel, on U.S. college campuses, in professional fellowships in the law, education, government, and communal leadership, and in so many other areas, all of these students come from across the country and from around the world, and they come from observant backgrounds and secular. They come from Jewish day schools and from private and public schools, but whatever their background, our students form communities of learning at Tikvah around the very issues that matter most to our shared sense of purpose and of meaningful, robust Jewish future. And while all of these efforts are exciting in their own right, and they are, we're here this evening under the banner of a different Tikvah program altogether, the Jewish Parents Forum. Over the last number of years, many parents within our community, parents of Tikvah students in fact, approached us and shared their concern over trends within the broader educational climate in America. The confusion of indoctrination with education, the usurpation of parental authority by schools and local government, and the constant onslaught against Jewish, Zionist, and American identity. And the truth is, we know these trends all too well. Several years ago, we established a national program for exceptional young middle school students coming from Jewish day school backgrounds. We call this program the Truman Program, and Rabbi Salavechik is a beloved teacher in that program. And I'm proud to say that Katz Hillel Day School is one of our 38 partner middle schools in this national program. And when we designed that program in the course of study for these young people, 7th and 8th graders, we committed ourselves to two core subjects. The Jewish experience in America and the religious and political history of modern Zionism. Why? Why those two subjects? Because the nobility of those notions is under constant threat and attack. And my friends, if our children and grandchildren are being told that their core identity as Jews and Zionists and as Americans are all sources of shame rather than pride, how can we expect our young people to grow in to the leaders of the next generation? No one wants a starring role in a campaign of indecency against the unfortunate. But what does animate our educational ethos is the absolute and the unapologetic belief that Israel and America, the chosen and the almost chosen nations, are beacons of progress, of hope, and of decency in the modern world. And Tikvah strongly believes that Jewish education will forever be rooted and grounded in the home and in what the Rav called the Masorah community. So parents came to us and they asked, could Tikvah convene a parental community around these convictions? And together with three exceptional leaders within the Tikvah community, Carolyn Rowan, Liz Lang, and Rebecca Sugar, we accepted the challenge and the Jewish Parents Forum was born. And in one short year, can hardly believe it, Caroline, it's only 1 year, but in one short year, over 6,000 parents and grandparents have attended our events and our live online conversations. We've discussed the educational imperative of the Shabbos table, how to assert parental rights when state bureaucrats move to seize them. And tonight, we will discuss the issue that perhaps burns most brightly in our heart and in our mind, the very war on American history itself. But my friends, it's not a coincidence that we're having this conversation here in Boca, here in South Florida. Looking across the fruited plains of this country, the Jewish community of South Florida stands as a beacon of purpose and truly as a community of very deep success. So interested and so beguiled has Tikvah been by your community, we published a 10,000-word essay just this past springtime that we titled Jerusalem on the Atlantic about your community. It was the lead essay in Mosaic, I think, this past April. If you haven't read it, read it. But in addition to the communal warmth and the shared sense of responsibility for which this community is so very well known, you have led the nation in not only accommodating and welcoming, but also guiding towards spiritual growth the thousands upon thousands of new Jewish residents making their home very purposefully right here. The growth of Jewish schools and new facilities for the shuls, extracurricular activities, cultural institutions, the growth is mind-boggling. I think such an explosion in population elsewhere would create strain, but here your warmth, your commitment to the Jewish people, to Klal Yisrael, has made it a tremendous success. And yours is a community that's committed itself to deep-seated traditionalism, but also with a newfound courage to build Jewish community in a new land. And I suspect that proud Floridians are indeed proud Americans and proud Jews. Tonight's keynote address, which will be followed by a question and answer format, will be delivered by Rabbi Dr. Meir Salavechik. Now, if any of you would like to submit a question for that question and answer component, my hope is that maybe some cards have already been distributed. If they haven't, I hope they will be. Some people are waving them, unless those just are different pieces of paper. Some people are waving them up. Our staff will come through during the lecture and we'll collect those questions, and the rabbi will have time to answer several of them. Rabbi Dr. Meir Salavechik is a distinguished senior rabbinic fellow at Tikvah, where he lectures widely and through all different media on the Hebrew Bible and Rabbinic Judaism's core texts and motifs, with a special eye towards their intersection with Western tradition and America's founding and America's societal fabric. Through his books, his articles, and daily Tikvah podcasts, including Bible 365, Jerusalem 365, what's coming next? Maybe not 365, we'll see. And countless video courses, Rabbi Salavechik really has become America's rabbi. And he serves as an intellectual beacon to Jews and non-Jews alike, seeking Torah wisdom in these modern and very not simple times. And my friends, this is all in addition to his serving as the rabbi of America's oldest shul, Congregation She'erith Israel in New York City, and as the dean of Yeshiva University's Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought. Without any further delay, it is my honor to present to you my dear friend and our teacher, Rabbi Meir Salavechik.
Let's do this. It was several years ago that I received a call from the rabbinic chaplain at a Cedars-Sinai hospital in Los Angeles, inviting me to come speak as a scholar in residence at their chapel to mark an event. Wasn't sure, I wanted to make the schlep to LA. Said I would think about it, hung up. And then I remembered a news story that I read about Cedars-Sinai Hospital, about a remarkable discovery that was made by the curator of the hospital's art collection. That going through the archives, the curator had chanced upon one of the great historical discoveries of our time, because he found in, I guess, the basement of Cedars-Sinai Hospital, the original luchot, the tablets of the Ten Commandments. I refer, of course, to the 2 tablets that were used by Cecil B. DeMille in the filming of his epic movie, The Ten Commandments. You see, DeMille had created actual luchot that he carved out of the very stone of what is thought to be Mount Sinai. And then, after filming, he gifted those luchos to Mount Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, so that the luchos would be at Mount Sinai. Then Mount Sinai Hospital, I think there was an earthquake, and Mount Sinai merged with another institution, became Cedars-Sinai, and the tablets were lost or overlooked or misplaced for decades, only to be discovered again when the curator did his inventory. So I was very fascinated by the story because I'm really, really interested in the Ten Commandments. The movie, The Ten Commandments themselves are good too, but I really like the movie. And so I called it back, or when he called me back, I said, "Wait, aren't you the hospital who discovered the luchos of the Ten Commandments?" And he said, "Yeah, and if you agree to come speak, you can hold them." And I did. And I did hold them. And it was one of the great moments of my life. And the experience inspired me to ponder the luchos, the tablets, not of DeMille, but of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is obviously a topic that pertains to our parsha and to those that follow. If I actually merited to hold the luchos of Moshe, what would go through my mind? What would be the source of their allure? And I realized as I thought that it would be not their miraculous nature that was most important, but rather rightly understood the exact opposite. Because as many note, the first set of tablets were created entirely by God, but were immediately shattered, a testament to our abject failure to keep the covenant that was forged in the Torah reading that we will encounter this Shabbos. But the story, as we know, did not end with failure. And the second set of tablets that were given on Yom Kippur, made by man, by Moshe, painstakingly crafted through human effort in order to restore the covenant, and only then God, as a sign of his forgiveness, wrote the words of the Decalogue upon them. Those luchos truly embodied our overcoming failure. The first set, the most miraculous objects in all of creation, brought miraculously into being by the fiery finger of God. Those luchos, as many note, Rabbi Salavechik has spoken about this, Rabbi Sachs has spoken about this, those luchos lasted all of a couple minutes, but the second, the tablets of repentance, those luchos lasted. These recarved luchos teach us something not only about God, but about ourselves, which is that sin can be overcome, that a nation experiencing collective guilt can learn from its failures, that it's not easy or miraculous, that it requires constant effort, but that we as a people can continue to strive ever higher toward an achievement of our ideals. And this, of course, is an important lesson to relearn, to analyze, to internalize, especially at this time. For it is just this notion that a new, very powerful movement seeks to reject in advancing a new understanding of America and its sins and its guilt. This movement, which has made massive inroads in the media and in the academy, seeks not a confronting of history, but a redefining of it, advancing an ahistorical approach to the American founding that seeks to define America as a mere series of sins, seeing America as a structurally sinful country and ultimately an irredeemable one, rather than what America's story actually is, which is the tale of an exceptional nation with a founding that changed the world. This approach, the correct approach, recognizes the greatness of the American experiment, not denying its sins, but still proudly proclaiming the blessing that the American ideals of equality and liberty have been to its citizens and to the world. Understanding that the way that the nation has addressed and overcome its sins is part of the remarkable nature of its story. And I want to argue today that while this ahistorical and intellectually dishonest movement, this war on American history, presents great dangers to America in general, it ought to be of particular interest to American Jews because this movement seeks to undo not only the story of America, but also the unique impact of the Hebrew Bible upon it. So to explain what I mean, let's begin by pondering what a biblically inspired understanding of American history would actually be. To study the founding is to see how central the story of biblical Israel, and especially the saga of the Exodus, was to the imagination of the American founders. Examples abound. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress created a committee of Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams, instructing them to design a seal for the United States. Franklin suggested for the symbol of the United States an image of Israel at the splitting of the sea, with Pharaoh, with the motto, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." Jefferson, meanwhile, suggested another Exodus image of the children of Israel in the wilderness following a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. These are amazing suggestions, which are often not told, as has been noted by historians, in most discussions of the story of the founding. Now, unfortunately, neither of these truly excellent suggestions were chosen. Congress was busy fighting a war, and so it just put these suggestions aside, and later it chose instead as the seal of the United States that creepy pyramid with the eye on top of it. I still don't know what that's all about, but I have it on good authority that it's linked to a treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. National Treasure, best movie ever, just putting that out there. Not to be confused, of course, with National Treasure Part 2, the worst movie ever. So it wasn't adopted as the seal, but still, George Washington as president would himself expressly make this comparison to the Exodus in a remarkable piece of correspondence, but this too is largely unknown because everyone knows when they think about Washington and letters, they think about Washington's letter to the Jews of Rhode Island. The truth is what happened is that when Washington became president, he got a lot of letters. All the Catholics in America got together and sent him a congratulatory letter. All the Baptists got together and put him a letter. The Quakers got together and put him a letter. And the Jews in America couldn't agree who would send the letter. So they sent him 3 letters. I am not making this up. There's like 1,000 Jews in America. 3 letters. At the end, you can see he's like wondering, why are these Meshuggahers sending me letters? But it's good that they did, because the letter to the Jews of Newport is well known, but the letter to the Jews of Savannah, Georgia is also incredible. And therein the Exodus is explicitly invoked. Washington concluded his letter as follows: "May the same wonder-working deity who long since delivering the Hebrews from their Egyptian oppressors planted them in the promised land, whose providential agency has lately been conspicuous in establishing these United States as an independent nation, still continue to water them with the dews of heaven and to make the inhabitants of every denomination participate in the temporal and spiritual blessings of that people whose God is," and then he actually writes out the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the name of God's name in the Bible that we don't pronounce. So what this means is that the founders saw echoes of the Hebrew Bible in their own lives. They identified with the leaders whose stories were told in Tanakh. They identified with us. I often tell the story about, this is told in Jane Levy's incredible biography of Sandy Koufax, Sandy Koufax, A Lefty's Legacy, about the famous Yom Kippur. By the way, side note, Yogi Berra, Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh Livracha, he died. I don't know what to make of this, but he died, the greatest theologian of our time. He died on Yom Kippur, 50 years to the day of the Sandy Koufax Yom Kippur. I don't know what to do with that, but that's, this is, as Rav Salavechik Zatzal would sometimes says, this is not a Hasidic Maisa, this is a true story. Okay. Anyhow, just wanted to throw that out there, see what would happen. So Koufax had this, so Don Drysdale pitched instead on Yom Kippur, right? And he got destroyed. So Walter Alston, the manager, went out to relieve him, and Drysdale looks at him. This is on Yom Kippur, and he says to him, "Hey, Skip, bet you wish I was Jewish today, too." Okay? So the truth is, he was joking, but the founders really, at certain points, identified with the Jewish story. And the question, of course, is why? Why? Sure, they saw miraculous moments in the unlikely story of the revolution, but a lot of countries have remarkable events in seminal periods in their history. What did they specifically see in the story of America? The answer is that just in their view, just as Israel left Egypt for Sinai to create a covenant, a set of ideas that it would present to the world, that would change the world, so they believe America was to be seen as just such a country. And to appreciate this aspect of America, that it is built around a set of ideas or a central idea, to really appreciate this, we have to see America through the eyes of outsiders, people who aren't American. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has reflected that he was fascinated when he came as a young man to America, and he visited the monuments and the memorials in Washington, D.C. And he wrote, what fascinated me was that each came with its own text. The Lincoln Memorial had the Gettysburg Address on one side and the other the second inaugural. And so with the others. And then he wrote, I suddenly realized that American memorials are not just to be seen, but also to be read. It's the exact opposite in London, he wrote. Go to Parliament Square, and you will see that the memorial to David Lloyd George has just 3 words. David Lloyd George. Benjamin Disraeli gets 2. Benjamin and Disraeli. As for Churchill, he gets just 1. Churchill. Now, it's amazing, because I think what Rabbi Sachs points out, if anyone deserves to have his language on the monument, it's Churchill. Churchill, who famously marshaled the English language and sent it into battle. And so when I saw Rabbi Sachs mention this, I started seeing it everywhere, because I'm a bit of an Anglophile and I go to England a lot. And you see it everywhere. So if you go to Washington, D.C., you'll see that even the souvenir shops have souvenirs with words on them. So ties quoting the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, and so forth. In Heathrow, no one's selling replicas of the Magna Carta. They're just not. There are pictures of the Queen and now of the King, palaces. Someone once gave me a mug, a coffee mug that had a picture on it of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. And when you pour hot coffee into it, the 6 wives disappear. It's a great mug, but can't use it on Shabbos. But no words. So why the difference? So this is what Rabbi Sachs said. He said as follows. He says, England is a traditional society where things are there because they're there. Whereas the United States is that rare phenomenon, a covenant society. Covenant societies represent conscious new beginnings. They are founded on an idea dedicated to a proposition. So he wrote. So America then compared itself to biblical Israel because it saw itself as a covenantal nation dedicated to an idea. But this in turn takes us to a new question. To what idea is it dedicated? What is the essence of the American covenant? The answer can only lie in the document that embodied our independence, which proclaimed as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. And the greatest theologian of America, its most profound, biblically inspired thinker about the meaning of America, was Abraham Lincoln, who, as Rabbi Lutz mentioned, called America an almost chosen nation. And it was Lincoln who recognized the importance of the Declaration in our covenantal identity. And as the historian Gordon Wood has pointed out, even before the Civil War, Lincoln wondered what made America America. What made us one country? After all, by the antebellum period, as Wood notes, 1 generation after the Revolution, America was already filled with immigrants from diverse countries who didn't descend from anyone who had fought in 1776. So what bound them together? For Lincoln, it was our common commitment as Americans to the Declaration, to its central thesis of human equality. That bound us together. You know, I remember when my kids were little, the National Archives had this shtick on their website that you could go online and sign the Declaration. Like you would give your name, and then you could print out a copy with all the regular signers, and then your name, like signing it. No treasure map on the back, but your name. But your name. And I think we made one with like our family signatures. So it would be like, you know, John Hancock, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Mayor Salavechik. And I think we sent it out on Purim for Shalach Manas. We put it in our Shalach Manas, and we developed a whole Purim Torah as part of it. We argued that it was actually the book of Esther that inspired the famous statement by Benjamin Franklin when they signed the Declaration that we must all hang together or we will most assuredly all hang separately. We had a whole vart. But essentially, that's what Lincoln says. What Lincoln says is in coming to America, we become Americans by emotionally signing the Declaration. And Lincoln said this in an amazing July 4th speech in 1858. This is what he said. He talks about immigrants. We have, besides these men descended by blood from our ancestors, among us perhaps half our people who are not descendants of all of these men. They are men who have come from Europe, German, Irish, French, and Scandinavian. Men that have come from Europe themselves or whose ancestors have come hither and settled here, finding themselves our equals in all things. If they look back through this history to trace their connection with those days by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that the moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration, and so they are. Then he concluded as follows: that is the electric cord in that declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. That, for Lincoln, is the covenant of America, because a covenant has the power to bind across time and space. On the same day that Lincoln called America an almost chosen nation, it was when he was visiting Philadelphia, on his way to his inaugural, he visited Independence Hall, where the Declaration had been signed. And speaking there, he joined biblical scripture with a commitment to America's moral mission. And he said, "I shall do nothing inconsistent with the teachings of these holy and most sacred walls. I never asked anything that does not breathe from those walls. All my political warfare has been in favor of the teachings that came forth from those sacred walls. May my right hand forget its cunning. May my right hand forget its cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if ever I prove false to those teachings." That's what he said. Now, obviously, if I forget thee, O Philadelphia, it doesn't really have the same ring to it. But the truth is, that's what Lincoln is saying. He's saying that Yerushalayim was the site of the biblical covenant. It's where the Aron, the Ark of the Covenant, was. And this is our covenant, the site where the Declaration was signed, where the Declaration was composed, where the Declaration was declared. That's our covenant. The statement that all men are created equal. That great idea is the one for which the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus-like miracles of the revolution, were wrought. But to say this, of course, is to immediately provoke another problem. The imagery of the Exodus invoked by the founders, by Franklin, Jefferson, Washington, is indeed remarkable. But it also reminds us, of course, of a sin that was originally at the heart of the founding. Many of those comparing George III to an Egyptian oppressor were themselves drivers of slaves. A nation that for Lincoln was defined by the declaration that all men are created equal was also one in which so many states declared an entire class of people as less than equal. A nation that for Lincoln was ultimately united by the proposition that all men were created equal. That nation members of that nation went on to kill each other over the issue of whether all men were truly created equal. How could America be a covenantal nation if it so obviously violated its covenant? But of course, the tale of biblical Israel is one of a covenantal nation that does, at several points, violate its covenant. That's the story of Tanakh. It was in pondering this, I think, that Lincoln hit upon another element of the biblical tale of chosenness, one which he ultimately placed at the heart of his understanding, his interpretation of America and the founders. It is true that the biblical Israel was founded as a covenantal nation, an exceptional nation, one which found its fullest expression in the ideas that were said at Sinai. But we know that built into that tale is the fact that almost immediately after that great covenantal moment which changed the world, Klal Yisrael, biblical Israel, violated its covenant. They embraced the ideals of I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have any other gods before me. And then immediately after that, they worshiped the golden calf. Not my ancestors, I'm a Levite. But the rest of you people. Yeah. Does that mean I'm better than you? Probably, yeah. But that's not the point of my talk right now. In a striking scene in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's medieval masterwork, the Kuzari, the Khazar king asked the rabbi, essentially, if you're so great, and if Sinai shows how special you are, and if you were chosen to change the world, how could you violate your covenant immediately after it was granted? Which is a good question. The Khazar king says, Take care, O Rabbi, lest too great indulgence in the description of the superiority of thy people make thee not unbearable, causing thee to overlook what is known of their disobedience in spite of the revelation. I have heard that in the midst of it they made a calf and worshipped it. And to this the rabbis immediately agree, responding, a sin which was reckoned all the heavier on account of their greatness. In other words, a people can be chosen, exceptional, and violate the very ideas that make it exceptional. And in fact, the story of the shattering of the tablets, the story of the golden calf, actually marked another moment in which the covenantal people of Israel, through its story of sin and repentance, gave a new idea to the world, one which had not been revealed at Sinai, an idea that altered forever the course of humanity. And here in explaining this, we can reference not our Torah reading of this week, but another important aspect of our calendar that we have just experienced, one that, like the Declaration of Independence, is linked to one of the cinematic achievements of our time, and that, of course, is Groundhog Day, which obviously I assume you all marked here. To all who I hope it was a good yontif for all who celebrated. Now, Groundhog Day, of course, is a movie that, rightly understood, embodies the impact that monotheism had on the world. You didn't see that. You have to look carefully in the plot to see that. Let's just very briefly review the plot. Spoiler alert. Groundhog Day stars the great actor Bill Murray as Phil Connors, a cynical and selfish weatherman who travels to the town of Puxatawney in order to do a puff piece on the emergence of the groundhog, or as he said famously in the film, this is the one time where television just cannot capture the drama of a large rodent predicting the weather. He treats everybody very rudely, wakes up the next day only to experience Groundhog Day again. He tries desperately to get out of the time loop in which he finds himself, and it's always in vain until he uses his time wisely, seeking to become a better person, focusing on using every minute of that day, February 2nd, toward a proper purpose. And having lived a perfect day, he actually wakes up the next morning and it's February 3rd. Tomorrow finally came. In other words, he changes. And in changing himself, he is given the gift of change. What gives life meaning is the fact that we are free in the way we act today to make tomorrow different. Not just in what the world is, but in who we are. That we ourselves are able to change so that the person we are tomorrow is better and different than today. That's the meaning of the movie. And you don't have to take my word for it, because someone with deeper insight into the story made the same point. Because decades after Groundhog Day's premiere, a musical version of the movie premiered on Broadway, and one man who came to see it was Bill Murray, B'chodo V'atzmo, the actor from the film. And the newspapers reported that he was weeping as he watched the story unfold. And so the New York Times reports that Mr. Murray, quote, was in tears. He waited a minute to compose himself before joining the rest of the audience to cheer the cast. So they asked him, the paper asked him, what was so moving about this movie? It's just a funny story. So he said, this is what the paper wrote. The idea that Mr. Murray trailed off as he paused to collect his thoughts. The idea that we just have to try again. We just have to try again. It's such a beautiful, powerful idea. In other words, we need not be trapped by the past. This is what we learn from the second luchos, from the second set of tablets. And therefore, in an interesting way, the very failure of biblical Israel at the golden calf and what followed, the reforging of a second set of tablets after Sinai, the commitment to do better, to become better, the notion of genuine guilt, followed by repentance, followed by atonement, followed by forgiveness, embodies, in its own way, as important a message that Judaism gave to the world as Sinai itself. And we can again quote Rabbi Sachs. He wrote as follows, quote, the sociologist Philip Rieff pointed out that the movement from paganism to monotheism was a transition from fate to faith. Fate to faith. By this he meant that in the world of myth, people were pitted against powerful, capricious forces personified as gods, who were at best indifferent, at worst hostile to humankind. All you could do was try to propitiate, battle, or outwit them. This was a culture of character and fate, and its noblest expression was the literature of Greek tragedy. So Rabbi Sachs writes, in other words, the pagan world believed in shame and sin without the true possibility of repentance and redemption. But Jews, Rabbi Sachs adds, quote, came to see the world in a completely different way. And he adds, repentance presupposes that we are free and morally responsible agents who are capable of change, specifically the change that comes about when we recognize that something we have done is wrong and we are responsible for it and we must never do it again. The possibility of that kind of moral transformation simply did not exist in ancient Greece or any other pagan culture, and this, he adds, transformed the human situation. For the first time, it established the possibility that we are not condemned endlessly to repeat the past. So he writes, biblical Israel did not only change the world in creating the covenant, but also in showing how, after failure, we can, to paraphrase Rabbi Sachs, break the irreversibility of what had happened in the past. It is the shattered tablets reforged that themselves embodied not only the covenant itself, but our ability to re-embrace the covenant when we have failed. Pagans believe in fate. We believe in faith, in freedom, in the possibility of atonement and redemption. And it's only with this in mind that we can appreciate, ladies and gentlemen, Lincoln's greatness and the way in which he applied the biblical lessons of Israel's story to the United States. Because if Lincoln was already before the war emphasizing that the Declaration's doctrine of human equality, that is what marked the covenantal ideals of the United States, then Lincoln came to understand during the carnage of the Civil War that America, as an exceptional nation, would be held responsible, like biblical Israel, for violating its covenant. But that, like biblical Israel, it could carve its tablets anew, inspired by its covenantal mission to achieve a more perfect union. This is the thesis of the greatest speech in American history, the second inaugural, which is less a speech than a drasha. It's a sermon. It really is. This is a president who is about to win a war that he had really, really wanted to win. And he doesn't get up there with a single note of triumphalism. He does not get up there and say, USA, USA. Not once did he say USA in the second inaugural. Instead, he essentially says that slavery had existed before the founding, and in the founding it was allowed to endure. As such, all America was complicit. The Tanakh tells us that for a covenantal nation, God is poked avon avot al banim al bnei vanim. He remembers the sins of the father on the children and the children's children if we don't learn from the past. And these words are revealed, we know, after the worship of the golden calf, a sin that immediately followed the covenant. Citing Tehillim, citing Psalms, Lincoln argued, as we know, that if God wills that it continue, meaning the war, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. Mishpatei Hashem emes tzadku yachtav. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And so Lincoln said, we are guilty and we are being punished. But still, of course, the biblical lesson of the second tablet still stands. The failure does not doom us to a Groundhog Day-like eternal recurrence. A covenantal nation believes not in fate, but faith. America, Lincoln argued at Gettysburg, could ensure that those buried there did not die in vain. America could bring about a new birth of freedom so that the principles of the Declaration did not perish from the earth. Not fate, but faith. Not eternal recurrence, but atonement and redemption. This is the covenantal approach. And this is what Lincoln presented to America. But of course, Lincoln was assassinated, Reconstruction slowed and stalled, segregation was restored throughout the South. But again, at its finest moments in American history, it was the ideals of the Declaration joined with the inspiration of faith that more truly advanced the American ideal of equality. Thus, Martin Luther King, fighting against segregation, calling out the sins of America, did so in the name of America's covenantal ideals, not in rejection of the American covenant, but inspired by it, saying famously, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So he said, a nation that violates its covenant can carve its tablets anew, inspired by the very covenantal ideals that it brought to the world. Yes, many of the founders who brought about this extraordinary event and reflected their greatness in bringing about this extraordinary event that was the revolution that presented the ideas that changed the world. These founders also, some of them violated the creed, but the creed was exceptional just the same. And it was the creed, the ideals of the revolution, the creed of human equality, in whose name slavery was ultimately abolished. This then is Lincoln's biblically inspired vision of the founding and of the founders' ideals. A story of a nation that became exceptional because it declared that all men are created equal, and whose exceptional nature is revealed when it strives at its best to uphold those ideals. But today, of course, what is fashionable is not Lincoln's approach to America at all. Instead, in the academy, in the media, in so much of popular culture, what is being advocated is the opposite. What's being advocated is that the true founding of America was not 1776 at all, when the founders announced that all men are created equal, but rather the year that slaves first arrived in America. Or, as the New York Times put it, quote, "Out of slavery and the anti-black racism it required, grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional," end quote. Now this quote, of course, comes from the central text of the central scripture of the new religious ethos, and that is the Times' Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project, which also argued, at least in its original version, that one of the central purposes of the revolution of 1776 was the preservation of slavery. Or as it put it, quote, "Conveniently left out of our founding mythology is the fact that one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery," end quote. This is 100% not true. It is a lie. And it was immediately denounced by the most prestigious historians in America, none of whom are affiliated with the right wing of the American political spectrum. James McPherson, Sean Wilentz, Gordon Wood. Wood himself wrote, "Far from protecting slavery, the American Revolution inflicted a massive blow to the entire slave system of the New World. Not only were the northern states the first slaveholding governments in the world to abolish slavery, but the United States became the first nation in the world to begin actively suppressing the despicable international slave trade. The New York Times has the history completely backwards," end quote. And then Wood added, no one should ever minimize the importance of slavery and Jim Crow segregation in our history. But to make 1619 the birth date of the nation, and to make slavery and segregation the frame for interpreting all of our turbulent and complicated past is not only false to the totality of our history, but it will divide us further and undermine whatever sense of comity and unity we have left. Those are Wood's words. And in other words, it's only the narrative that Lincoln established, that there is an electric cord that we all believe in, that can truly bind a nation of such diverse backgrounds together. And indeed, in so many schools, students are now being taught the opposite of the American ideals. They are being taught to care. They are being taught to care not about the content of the character of their fellow students, but to care about color. They are taught that they live forever defined by their race, and that if they are not a person of color, then they are part of the structural evil of America. They are, in other words, being taught that America has not overcome its sins, and that America can never overcome its sins. What the new ethos rejects, in other words, is the biblical conception of repentance in totality. So the question of the Kuzari king is just as important and relevant today. Can an exceptional nation, a covenantal nation, sin profusely and still remain exceptional and use its exceptional ideas to overcome its sins? Of course it can. And this point was made in a more profoundly and eloquent manner than I ever could by Tim Scott, an African-American senator from South Carolina, who in his own career highlights how much has changed. Because this is a man who is the senator from South Carolina, where Fort Sumter occurred, where the Confederacy was born. He beat in the Republican primary Strom Thurmond's son in the Republican primary. Tim Scott, African-American senator. Tim Scott said the following, quote, 100 years ago, kids in classrooms were taught the color of their skin was their most important characteristic. And if they looked a certain way, they were inferior. Today, kids again are being taught that the color of their skin defines them. And if they look a certain way, they're an oppressor. From colleges to corporations to our culture, people are making money and gaining power by pretending we haven't made any progress, by doubling down on the divisions we've worked so hard to heal. And then Scott said, you know this stuff is wrong. Hear me clearly. America is not a racist country. It's backwards to fight discrimination with different discrimination. And it's wrong to try to use our painful past to dishonestly shut down debates in the present. And then Tim Scott added the following so simply, so beautifully, so biblically, drawing on his Christian background, but in the same spirit that I am arguing today. Senator Scott added as follows. He said, we get to live in the greatest country on earth, the country where my grandfather, in his 94 years, saw his family go from cotton to Congress in one lifetime. So I am more than hopeful, I am confident that our finest hour is yet to come. Original sin is never the end of the story, not in our souls and not in our nation. The real story is always redemption. The real story is always redemption. Senator Scott is exactly right. We believe, in other words, not in the pagan world of fate, but in the biblical world of faith. And the question then is, why is this vision, why is Senator Scott's vision not being embraced in our contemporary culture? And to ask this question is to answer it. Because those that are engaged in what we call the war on American history would rather not embrace Senator Scott's vision at all, because what is happening in the realm of the academy and of history is not happening in a vacuum. It's not merely an assault on American history, but rather on the biblical approach to history, on the biblical insistence that repentance, atonement, and redemption is a possibility in history. When I visited Cedars-Sinai Hospital to claim my prize of Cecil B. DeMille's tablets, I was shown a picture of when they were first brought by DeMille to the hospital. And they were actually affixed to the walls, the outside walls of Mount Sinai. They told me two things they showed me two things when I was there in LA. First, they took me to a statue near the hospital, which was a duplicate of Michelangelo's Moses, with one difference: the horns were missing. Horns were missing. And so they told me that there was a donor to the hospital who decided he really wanted a replica of Michelangelo's Moses. He had no idea, of course, that Michelangelo's Moses had horns. And so they order a replica, and it comes. They open the crate. It's a Jew with horns. And so he had them, take off the horns for the Los Angeles version of Michelangelo's Moses, which shows in California, even the statues get plastic surgery. And then there was the tablets. And it showed him bringing the tablets to the wall. And overseeing that was governor of the state, Governor Ronald Reagan, affixing it to the wall. So, of course, I took a picture of that picture to have with me. And I thought to myself, I can't imagine that happening today. Can you imagine a governor of California affixing 10 Commandments to a public hospital? And what that highlights is that we live in an age of shattered tablets, where so much of contemporary culture denies both what is the genuine American concept of equality, that what matters is the content of your character and not the color of your skin. And so many deny as well the biblical heritage that so profoundly impacted Lincoln. What inspired the movement against slavery was the Second Great Awakening, a resurgence of religious fervor in the 19th century. Today, the Great Awakening has been replaced with the Great Awokening. In an age of shattered tablets, what replaced biblical heritage is another faith, with its own neo-pagan high priests, with its own elect, but one which rejects the biblical promise that, as Tim Scott put it, the real story is always redemption. If the story of the tablets restored is the story of a movement from fate to faith, from blind forces to freedom and progress, the proponents of wokeism advocate a movement in the opposite direction, denying that we are a better country on the issue of race, denying that we can be better. It embraces a pagan form of religion, and that religion is wokeism. John McWhorter, in his book Woke Racism, argues that the new ethos is itself a religion, and he writes about its proponents that, quote, "To these people, actual progress on race is not something to celebrate, but to talk around. This is because, with progress, the elect lose their sense of purpose. Note," he writes, "what they are after is not money or power, but sheer purpose, in the basic sense of feeling like you matter and that your life has a meaningful agenda." End quote. This, in other words, is a faith that does not want to hear about redemption from sin because it does not believe in such a redemption. This is about, for this new elect, engaging in rituals of a newfound faith that reflect your embrace of America's guilt so that you too can be granted the status of elect. And it has received a rapturous response from many. Or as the writer James Patterson put it, like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, state entities, corporations, and academic institutions offer patronage to the woke gods in exchange for their loyalty. And like the priests in those old Egyptian temples, the consultants grant prestige and temporary absolution while keeping the money. The tablets have been shattered. America is being redefined. What McWhorter calls the elect do see themselves as an elect, and they are embracing a new faith. And as McWhorter also writes, they are coming for your kids. They seek to re-educate them about all that this country represents. And that, of course, is why Tikvah is so important, for it has stood in the vanguard of a movement to provide an education to our children that truly teaches them what America was, what America is, and therefore what America can be. It is teaching thousands of students, both through its online courses, through its gifted educators, and through the schools with whom they work, with whom Tikvah works. It is teaching students also how the Bible lies at the heart of the moral well-being of America and the West. And that is why I'm so, so proud to be affiliated with Tikvah. So, so proud to represent it here this evening. For me, ladies and gentlemen, this is profoundly personal. My own interest in the story of America is linked to my own hero, which is my grandfather, Rabbi Salavechik, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha. My grandfather was one of the Torah giants of his generation. Also loved America very dearly. My grandfather went to law school. That was his plan B if Torah didn't work out, I guess. And never took the bar. But he spoke about America all the time. He wrote a well-known essay called Civil Rights and the Dignity of Man, wherein he wrote the following: "The maxim of man was endowed by his creator with certain inalienable rights was not an innovation of the founders of the American Republic. These men were impressed with the doctrine of human rights, which flows naturally from the concept of the dignity of man and the image of God in which he created man, as they knew from their biblical background." My grandfather believed in the American idea of equality, and I saw it in every aspect of his life. He truly believed that what mattered about a human being was not the color of their skin, but the content of their character. I would take my grandfather. My grandfather, as many of you know, had a debilitating stroke and would travel between Chicago and New York to teach at Yeshiva University. And I would take him to Newark Airport, often for the flight home. I would see him interact with so many different people, of so many different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different racial backgrounds. They all loved him, and they treated him with profound respect because he treated them with profound respect. Somebody told me a story that someone was traveling, this is a long time ago, but right after he passed away, that someone came to Newark Airport, an Orthodox Jewish Chicagoan, for a flight to Chicago, And there was a long line for a luggage check, so he resigned himself to a long wait. And one of the luggage handlers came over and said, excuse me, sir, are you going to Chicago? So he said, yes. He says, well, do you know the rabbi who just died? So he says, you mean Rabbi Salavechik? So the luggage handler says, okay, you come with me. And he moves his luggage to the front of the line. And he says, you see, Rabbi Salavechik used to come through here, and I wanted to do something. This is what the luggage handler says. Wanted to do something to honor his memory. So I decided that whenever I see somebody, meaning with a yarmulke, I ask them if they know the rabbi from Chicago. If yes, they get to go to the front of the line, which is, of course, the ultimate Jewish reward, obviously. But the truth is, he loved them. They loved him. And that was who my grandfather was. He was someone who truly believed that all men were created equal. And my grandfather also was someone who presciently warned that America would go awry if its ethos became detached from its biblical foundation. In an America where the tablets were shattered, that we have a lot to worry about. I thought of my grandfather when I read the book Civility by the African-American Yale law professor Stephen Carter. It's a very interesting book, and in the book he quotes, this is not a Jewish professor, he quotes various svarim at various points, like halachic works at different points here and there in the book, at least one or two, obscure ones. And I was wondering what brought about such an interest in these obscure Orthodox texts. Why such interest in Judaism? And an examination of the book reveals that in his youth, Professor Carter met a religious Jew that was responsible for a life-changing experience. He recounts that as a child, his family, his African-American family, moved to a white neighborhood in suburban Washington, D.C. and Virginia, and he felt very uncomfortable. And then he writes, and all at once, a white woman, arriving home from work at the house across the street from ours, turned and smiled with obvious delight and waved and called out welcome in a booming, confident voice I would come to love. She bustled into our house, only to emerge minutes later with a huge tray of cream cheese and jelly sandwiches, which she carried to our porch and offered around with her ready smile, simultaneously feeding and greeting the children of a family she had never met, and a black family at that, with nothing to gain for herself except perhaps the knowledge that she had done the right thing. We were strangers, black strangers, and she went out of her way to make us feel welcome. This woman's name was Sarah Kestenbaum, and she died much too soon, but she remains, in my experience, one of the great exemplars of all that is best about civility. And then Carter goes on to say, by describing what she did, he writes, in the Jewish tradition, this duty is captured in the requirement of chesed. That's what he writes. The doing of acts of kindness, which is in turn derived from the understanding that human beings are made in the image of God. And Carter writes as follows, a life without faith is a life without the most powerful language of sacrifice and aspiration the human race has ever known. And he adds, in the Western religious traditions, faith in God provides a justification for the equality that liberal philosophy assumes and cherishes, but is often unable to defend. Religion, he further writes, is part of what motivated Sarah Kestenbaum, our welcoming neighbor back in 1966, whose family was deeply religious. Religion offers a sacred language of sacrifice, selflessness, awe, that enables believers to treat their fellow citizens as fellow passengers. But even, he writes, if religion is the engine of civility, it has too few serious practitioners, which is why those who are truly moved by it to love their fellow human beings are so special. I learned that truth in 1966 when I discovered how a single act of genuine and unassuming civility can change a life forever. One biblical act can change the world because we believe in all that the tablets teach us. We believe not in fate, but faith, in freedom, in the possibility of change. These are dispiriting times for those who care about America. But one biblically inspired life can make all the difference in the world, and our country so badly needs educated, biblically inspired lives. Let us reinvigorate the spirit of the founding. Let us seek to teach it to our children. Let us take up the shards of a shattered biblical heritage in America. And with faith and hope, let us seek to carve the tablets anew. Thank you very much.
These questions come from your listeners, from our audience, and I'm actually struck by so many veins of commonality between the questions, obviously each written from a parochial point, but so many veins of commonality. So I want to first ask on a macro level, the odiousness that you describe in the culture and in its direction, what can we as a organized Jewish community in all of its stripes and flavors, Lord knows how many letters to President Washington there would be today with more than 1,000 Jews in America, but what can we as an organized Jewish community do to stem the tide?
I mean, the answer, I think, is only build institutions and find allies. We need to work on what we're teaching our children, and we need to work on educating our children. For my own family, that means not only relying on school, though school is essential, and of course, everything that educators do is essential, but we need to speak about it at home, we need to talk about it at home. Salavechiks go on Chol Hamoed American history trips. I take my kids to Civil War battlefields. I took my son on a Segway tour of Gettysburg. And I ran over a tree branch and fell off my Segway. So now I can say that I was injured at Gettysburg. The world will little forget what I did there, yeah. But I do think that we need to build institutions. That's why Tikvah is so essential, of course. And then we need to find allies, because we are not alone. You know, that's the thing. If saving America, I think that that patriotic Jews play an important role in America, but if it fell to us alone, just by sheer numbers, I don't think we can do it. But there are a huge amount of people who are deeply, deeply concerned about it, who are also thinking about how we educate our children, how we create schools of learning, how we teach at the higher and at the college and graduate level. And there are religious Christians around America, of course, who are inspired by the resilience of the Jewish people to work toward their own, to be inspired and toward their own resilience. So the only way is by building institutions, but also by finding allies. We can't do this alone, I think.
Institution building, allyship is important as we look beyond the confines of our home, but I would say probably by a significant majority, the questions that were submitted wanted to look inside, into the home, which you yourself referenced, and I'm sorry to hear about the Gettysburg injury.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you for your service to the station. Thank you. When we look
I don't feel you've said that enough to me, by the way.
When we look inside our homes, many of these questions are written in a very personal manner.
Yeah.
I'm a grandmother, and the question continues. I'm raising a family outside of the Orthodox community. The question continues. A specific question here says, as an Orthodox father, and then the question continues. So advice for parents, advice for grandparents coming from more or less traditional homes. I suspect that the message you shared today broadly resonates with our friends assembled. Tachlis, as they say. What can we do in our homes to build young people of strong character and Jewish and American resolve?
Yeah. So, again, first I want to emphasize that I don't believe that there is one way. You know, every child has different needs, and there are different approaches that work in different situations. But it seems to me that we need to inculcate in our children, first and foremost, the notion that they are part of something larger than themselves, and that is the true source of meaning in life, and that is what is missing from postmodern life. Postmodern life begins with the individual and allows the individual, embraces the individual's choices, no matter what they are. And covenantal thinking is the opposite. Of course, it's not about denying individuality in any way, but it seeks for the individual to find meaning in the larger whole. And second, I think in our hyper a credentialized world, we need to emphasize the fact that character matters more than that. There's a very interesting speech that Antonin Scalia gave where he describes how his favorite founder was Washington. And he says that essentially you might think differently because Antonin Scalia is so smart and he went to Harvard and law school and he's the Supreme Court justice and so on and so forth. And Washington was not, you're not going to make the case that he was the most intellectual of all the founders, but he admired Washington's character. And then he quoted his father. He said something like, you can rent out brains, something like that. And that doesn't mean, of course, that he did not value, no one who met Antonin Scalia, and I had the joy of meeting him and interviewing him, would say that he didn't value intelligence. No one would say that. But character matters more. But that's not, you don't get credentials for character. I think so. Those are the two emphases that I would make.
And are you suggesting that if we more deeply, more consistently laud and extol and recognize accomplishments of character within our home, that will just grow and amplify?
Yeah, I mean, I say all the time, just because I mentioned my grandfather, I learned more, and I went to many of my grandfather's shiurim, but I learned more from just accompanying him in life than I did from the Torah he taught. And I want to emphasize, he taught a lot of Torah, and I only learned a very little bit of it, but I spent a lot of time learning Torah with him. But I learned more from just seeing him in the world, seeing how the values of the Torah translate in different situations in life. And we need to valorize men and women of character and heroism and moral courage more than, God knows, the celebrities that exist today. Yeah.
Before my last question to you, really before our last question to you, I would just say when you mentioned the late Justice Scalia, one of Tikvah's great joys in 2022 was us publishing in Hebrew, B'Shem HaChok, the collected writings of Justice Scalia in Hebrew, which has sold thousands and thousands of copies in Israel,
it's
inspiring
amazing.
a new generation of thoughtful, both citizens, advocates, judges.
Can I share with you my favorite Justice Scalia story? It's in the biography of Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia met somebody who was a big fan of his, and he said, you should know, Justice Scalia, I named my pet fish after you. So I'm a big admirer. I just wanted to let you know I named it fish. So Justice Scalia said, wow. So it is, yeah. So he says, I would welcome, if any of you want to name your fish after me, I would welcome that. So he says, did you name any of your other fish after any other Supreme Court justices? And he says, Justice Scalia ate the other fish.
Very good.
Yeah.
So, Rabbi, let us end on a note of optimism.
Elevated note.
Of fish tanks. No,
fish cannibalism, yes.
Let us end on a note of optimism.
Yeah.
I suspect that everyone in this room is passionate about what you've taught us, what we've been discussing this evening. Yeah. But moxie and bandwidth and time are all finite.
Yeah.
Where is proud Jewish Americans are we to invest our effort? Within our walls that define our sacred homes, beyond them, what's the priority to achieve our society redeemed?
Well, of course, we have specific obligations that nothing else in life can undo. Our obligations as parents or as children or as family members or as members of our community are just obligations that we have. Beyond that, I believe very much in vocation. I believe that God gives each one of us gifts, and each one of us can make an impact in a profound way. The Sarah Kestenbaum story is such a meaningful one to me. Rabbi Sachs, I think, made it famous because he started quoting it a lot, which I didn't like because then I used it in less speeches for a time. It was very inconvenient for me, but I just noticed when I was because I was working on this speech, I just looked it up again, and I noticed that he had written a column about it, and he said that he spoke about it many years, and then many years later he came to D.C. area, and he actually met people who knew Sarah Kestenbaum. And he told this story, and they said that they didn't know this story, but they said, but that's Sarah. It's just to hear it is to know that it was her, because it was her unique character. So you have this one woman who did one thing, not because that was the only thing she did, because that's how she acted in general, in humility and forever changed the way this prominent public intellectual thinks about Judaism and writes about Judaism. I believe that each one of us has specific gifts. There's an amazing, I'll end with this. There's an amazing article by David Galernter. He wrote this a long time ago. This is when somebody who felt he should have got the Nobel Prize led a campaign after the Nobel Prizes were awarded and he didn't get it, to also be awarded the Nobel Prize. Like he had like a high, it was like big ads in the New York Times. The shameful wrong that must be righted, because they gave for a certain field and he was also in that field and he felt he should have gotten it. So he said, first he described all these great people, David Galernter, who never got a Nobel Prize. So he said, first is Churchill got a Nobel Prize for literature and didn't show up to get it. He sent his wife, because he was busy. He was the prime minister, he was again. And then he says something like, I think of the Lubavitcher Rebbe busily trying to change the world. I don't think it bothered him that he didn't have a Nobel Prize. And then he writes, okay, so Lubavitcher Rebbe was one of the most famous rabbis in human history. He says, what about us? So he says something like, there's no Nobel Prize for getting your wife to marry you, not being a jerk despite all the provocations, raising your children to thoughtful adulthood, or any of the other achievements in life that truly matter. And I believe that very strongly, and I think HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives each one of us gifts, and the question is whether we use those gifts to make a difference before the true judge that matters most.